Today, let's dive into one of the most important tools in a commercial photographer's kit, lenses. If you're serious about creating high-end product photos and videos for top-tier advertising campaigns, then knowing which focal lens to use and when is really critical. In this video, I'll break down the best lenses for product photography, show you some real-world examples from professional shoots, and share my personal go-to focal lens for capturing crisp, impactful, and commercially polished images. And if you're just starting out or want to invest in just one lens that can handle about 99% of your commercial product photography, I'll reveal exactly which one I'd choose at the end of this video. So stick around, as this is knowledge straight from my 15 years of experience shooting ad campaigns for global brands. Alright, so when it comes to buying a new lens or shortlisting a lens for commercial project, I always keep these three things in mind: sharpness, color, and contrast right in the camera itself. Okay, now out of these three features, sharpness for me is absolutely non-negotiable, because you cannot replicate the effect that you get by using a sharp lens in Photoshop, right? In Photoshop, you can always give an illusion of sharpness by manipulating the contrast and things like that, but you will never have the exact same result that you will get when you use a sharp lens. So all the lenses that I'm going to show you today are absolutely sharp, and the other two things that I mentioned, which is the contrast and the color, so these two things you can still manipulate in post, because we are shooting in RAW and we have enough room to manipulate color and contrast later on in post as well. But still, I prefer lenses that can check all these three boxes, so that my post production is also minimal and I have beautiful colors and contrast to begin with, right? So having said that, let's move on to the first set of lenses, which are the macro lenses. When it comes to macro lenses, I'm using two focal lengths, which is 105 and 85. And in fact, before I show you the lenses, let me tell you why I prefer using macro lenses for high-end product photography, right? So the capability of a macro lens allows you to fill the entire frame with product details, crisp product details, right? So in fact, if you look at my body of work, you will see really highly detailed product images. And in fact, I'm going to show you some examples from my commercial projects. So we'll see which lens is used to create what all photos. So the capability of a macro lens is that it allows you to reproduce 1:1 ratio when it comes to shooting products, especially smaller products like jewelry, watches, beverages, cosmetics, and things like that, right? So the first lens that I'm using is this lens from Sigma. It is 105 DG Macro HSM f 2.8, and by the way, this lens is an old lens, and by old I mean this is an F mount lens, and right now I'm using the Z series camera bodies. Like this is the Nikon Z9, which is the main camera body for all my commercial work. But still, on the Z mount camera system, I'm still using my older F mount lenses via the adapters, as these lenses are still one of the best lenses when it comes to photography, right? So at the time when I bought this particular lens, the Sigma Macro 105 lens was better than the Nikon's 105 macro lens at that time. I'm talking about the F mount Nikon macro lens 105, and the Sigma was better when it came to color, contrast, and sharpness, and that was the reason why I picked up this lens instead of the Nikon's 105 macro. But if you're buying a lens today, then the newer Z mount Nikon Macro 105 is a fantastic lens. Beautiful colors, contrast, and sharpness. You can't go wrong with that either. But if you're looking for value for money, then you can pick up this lens, which is an older F mount lens, and the prices are slashing. The prices are coming down. So you can pick up this lens and you will have excellent value for money, right? So also, let's have a look at some of the projects where I use this particular lens to create photos. So the very first photo is right here. Now this shot of the Budweiser beer was done using the Sigma 105 lens, way back when I started with product photography. And if you swipe, you can see the behind the scenes. And here you can see that I'm using the 105 Sigma lens with my older camera body, which was D800, right? Now, I have absolutely no complaints with this lens. It is very, very crisp, very sharp, gives beautiful results. So even today, I do not hesitate to use this particular lens. And in fact, let me show you some other examples. So let's have a look at another project where I use this particular lens. So right here you can see this was a campaign done for this brand where the photos were used in various places like magazines, Elle, Vogue, Cosmopolitan, on billboards, in shopping malls and things like that. So using this particular lens on a full frame body, which was D800 at that point of time, I was able to create this beautiful photo of this foundation where you can see the details very, very clearly. So this photo was blown up huge on hoardings and printed in magazines, as I mentioned. So let me just show you one such magazine that I have here. So this is the Elle edition. So it was also there, as I mentioned, in Vogue and Cosmopolitan and hoardings. I have absolutely no complaints in the resolution, the quality, the color and contrast when using this particular lens. Okay, I was very, very happy with the result. And by the way, you can also check out these photos and behind the scenes on my Instagram if you want to have a look at them later on. Let me show you another project where again I use this particular lens, and for this campaign, again the photos were to be used on ATL, in magazines, hoardings and shopping malls. So again we wanted to capture and show the details, right? So that is why I preferred using the 105 macro lens again. And as you can see, these photos are highly detailed. These are close-up shots of the lipsticks and nail paints and basically cosmetics. And again, these photos ended up coming in magazines. I have the Elle edition right here. So what I'm saying is this is a fantastic lens even in 2025 if you want to use it for product photography, especially when you're shooting cosmetics, jewelry, watches and things like that, right? Now let's move on to the next lens, which is a very specialized lens, and it also happens to be a macro lens, one of my favorites here. So this is the 85 PCE f2.8 Nikon lens, right? And the speciality of this lens is that apart from being a macro lens, it is also a tilt shift lens, right? And Nikon calls it perspective control, but it's the same thing, you can call it perspective control or tilt shift. It means the same, right? Now by tilt shift, what I mean is that there are various knobs here. So using this particular feature, let me see if you can see this lens, right? So you can actually tilt this lens like this, okay, right? And you can also shift it just like this, okay? So these two features are very, very crucial when it comes to high-end product photography, as this gives you a lot more advantages apart from being a macro lens. And this lens pretty much stays on my Nikon Z9 all the time, and most of the campaigns that I've shot and I shoot even today are done on this particular lens, right? So a fantastic lens. It has again very good sharpness, but when it comes to color and contrast, I would say that it is not the best, but still, as I mentioned, that you can always correct the color and contrast later on in Photoshop as well. So no complaints here, because the features of tilt and shift that this lens has are not available on any other lens, especially in the Nikon lineup. So now let's have a look at some of the photos where I use this particular lens, the 85 tilt shift. So let me show you a recent project that I shot using this lens. So if you look at this particular photo, right? And interestingly, I'll show you why I prefer using a tilt shift lens for product photography, right? So if you look at this particular shot and just look at the camera angle. In fact, let me show you the behind the scenes of this, so you will understand the way the camera is positioned in respect to the product, the bottle on the surface. So if you look carefully here, look how the camera is pointed towards the bottle, right? At such an angle, if I focus on the label, then in that case, the cap of the bottle will go out of focus, right? So there is no way to get the entire bottle in focus if I don't use this particular lens, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm tilting the lens to manipulate the focal plane so that not only the label but also the cap and the entire plane on the bottle surface is tack sharp in focus, and at the same time the background falls slightly out of focus, right? So this is my style of work. If you have a look at my body of work, I'm using shallow depth of field in most of my projects, and at the same time I like to have absolute control on the focal plane, right? So this particular lens allows me to do that. In fact, let me show you another example where you can better understand why I prefer having the tilt feature on this lens, right? So this is another shot from the same project, and again, if you look carefully at the photo, the camera is pointed up towards the product, right? The camera is looking up at the product. In fact, let's go and have a look at the behind the scenes here. So you can clearly see that the camera is looking up at the beer cans. So in this case, again, if I had to focus on on the branding, the label where it says El Aguila, okay, if I focus there, then at the same time the top part of the can would be out of focus, right? But I don't want to do that. I want the entire branding to be tack sharp, but at the same time I still want to have a shallow depth of field, right? So in this case, the tilt shift lens becomes really crucial, and it gives me the result that I want in a single photo. Now you might be thinking that you can still get the entire product in focus using focus stacking, but let me tell you, if you do focus stacking, you will not have a similar result, okay? And in fact, this particular lens, the 85 tilt shift lens, demands an entire episode, a different episode to cover the features and go into the details. So I'll share those things with you in another video. But for now, just keep this in mind that a tilt shift lens is very crucial when it comes to high-end product photography because of the features it offers, right? In fact, let me show you another example where I use the same lens, but in this case, I did not use the tilt or shift feature. So if you look at the photo, and by the way, this is the photo where I'm using AI production as an AI environment in the background. So, and if you look at the angle, the camera is looking straight at the product, right? Let's have a look at the behind the scenes where you can see the camera angle. So here you can clearly see that the camera is pointed straight at the product, right? So in this case, I don't need to use the tilt feature because the focal plane automatically aligns with the branding on the bottle, right? So automatically I'm getting everything in focus, but still I chose to use the 85 PCE lens or the tilt shift lens in this case because since I use this lens for rest of the visuals in this project, I preferred using the same lens for this particular photo as well to maintain similar colors and contrast and sharpness, to basically have consistency across various visuals from the project, right? Now let's move on to the other aspect of using macro lenses, which is a good working distance from the product. And by that what I mean is that if you've noticed, both of my macro lenses are of focal length 105 and 85, longer lenses, longer focal lengths, right? I'm not using a 50 macro or a 60 macro because of a reason, okay? And the reason, as I mentioned, is a good working distance. Now by working distance, what I mean is that let's say that this is the product, and if I have my camera really close to the product, let's assume that I'm using a 50 macro where I have to place the camera really close to the product, then I won't have enough room around the product to build my lighting setup, right? And also in cases when I'm shooting liquid splashes and powder bursts and things like that, I want to maintain a good distance between the product and the camera so that I have enough room around the product to build the lighting setup and to throw liquid splashes without destroying my expensive camera gear, right? In fact, let's have a look at one such photo. so that you will understand what I mean by good working distance. So in this case, this is a photo where I'm capturing the liquid splashes on this Clinique jar. And in this particular shot, I've used the 105 Sigma lens because of a reason. As I mentioned, that I wanted to have a good working distance, and you can see here in the behind the scenes photo that there's good enough distance between the product and the camera for me to throw these liquid splashes on set, right? So do keep this in mind. Don't buy a macro lens or focal length like 50 mm, 60 mm. The minimum focal length that I recommend for a macro lens is 85 and beyond, right? So 85 is the minimum, and if you go for a higher focal length, perfectly fine, right? Now let's move on to the next lens, which is the Zeiss Milvus 50 mm lens. Now, right now it is on my camera body, Nikon Z9, and this particular lens is an absolute beast when it comes to quality. I mean, build quality, color, sharpness, contrast. It's absolutely beautiful. If you can have this lens from the Milvus series, in fact, any lens from the Zeiss Milvus series, you will never be disappointed, right? This lens is of extremely high quality when it comes to any feature that I mentioned, right? So why I'm using this 50 mm lens or 50 mm focal length is, when I'm shooting products in environment, or when I want the products to look larger than life and heroic, right? So in fact, this is not a macro lens, right? This is a regular 50 mm focal length, but at the same time, it can get close enough to the product where I can use it for products like, like jewelry, watches, drinks, cosmetics, and things like that, right? And in fact, let's have a look at some of the photos so you can better understand where exactly I would recommend or prefer using a 50 mm focal length, right? So the first case that I mentioned was shooting the products in environment, right? So if you look at this particular photo, you will see that you are also seeing the environment around the product, right? And so in this particular campaign, we were trying to replicate the underwater ocean environment around the product. So you see a very similar environment around the product, and I'm not trying to fill the entire composition or the entire frame with the product itself, right? So in this case, 50 mm lens was a perfect choice for this particular campaign. And as you can see in behind the scenes, I'm using the Zeiss Milvus 50 mm for this particular shot. Very, very happy with the color, the contrast, and the sharpness. Everything is of top-notch quality when it comes to the Milvus range of lenses from Zeiss. And the lens is extremely sharp, even wide open at f1.4. And that is how I'm pretty much using this lens all the time. I keep it at f1.4 when I'm shooting products, and I'm very, very happy with the result, right? In fact, let's have a look at another such photo from the same campaign. Now again, if you look at this photo, here the product is shown in environment. So as I mentioned, whenever I want to include environment around the product, I prefer using a 50 mm lens. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to have a look at the behind the scenes of this photo, you can visit my Instagram and have a look at all of these projects there. Now, the other thing that I use the 50 mm lens for is to make the products look heroic and larger than life, right? So for that, let's have a look at another photo where it will be clear what exactly I'm saying, right? So let's have a look at this photo of Jack Daniels. And now if you look carefully at the photo, look at how the cap is looking, right? Right at the top of the bottle. The cap is curved, as if you are standing down and looking up at the product, or in other words, the product is looking huge and larger than life and heroic, right? So to achieve this particular effect, I use 50 mm lens, and I place it slightly closer to the product to distort it in a way that it looks larger than life, right? Now, of course, for this particular shot, I used 50 mm focal length, but the lens was from Nikon, as at that point of time I didn't have the Zeiss 50 mm. But anyways, this focal length is really, really a fantastic choice when you want to show the products in environment or want to make the products larger than life, right? Right, so let's move on to the next lens now, which is this 35 mm Milvus f1.4 from Zeiss, again from the same Milvus series. And as I mentioned earlier, I am so happy with the Milvus lenses from Zeiss. The quality is absolutely top notch. They are built like a tank, all metal construction. Even before you use this lens, just by holding it in your hands, you would know that the photo quality has to be absolutely world class. That is how these lenses are, right? So, although this focal length, which is 35 mm, I'm not using it much in product photography, but in certain cases, this focal length can really come in handy, especially when you're shooting, let's say, top-down flat lays, where you're shooting an entire range of products, or when you're shooting bigger sets where you want to capture the environment around the product and you have a huge set. So in those cases, this lens comes in really handy. In fact, let me show you some examples here so you will have a better understanding of what I'm saying. So let me just go down to that photo where I use this particular lens for a campaign. So here it is, right? So in this particular shot, it's a flat lay. I'm looking down at the products, and to show the entire composition in one single frame, I use the 35 mm Zeiss lens. Beautiful results again, fantastic sharpness, color, contrast, everything is top notch as I mentioned. And there's another shot again where I use the 35 mm lens, to show the entire range of products. And let me show you another example of showing the product in environment where I use this particular focal length. So this is the photo which is from the same campaign that I showed you, where the product was shot underwater. So this particular photo is also from the same campaign, but for this shot, I've used the 35 mm to show the environment around the product, right? So as I said again that I very rarely use 35 focal length. So consider it as your last priority to get a 35 focal length, right? Now one more thing that I wanted to mention is that when you are using lenses from the same series, like in this case I showed you Milvus 35 from Zeiss, and at the same time I have another lens from the same series, the 50 mm Milvus and the 35 mm Milvus lens. So when you're using lenses from the same series, you're going to have the exact same color, exact same contrast and sharpness, right? So this is really crucial when you're doing commercial projects, because in commercial shoots, you are never creating a single photo, right? You would be creating a bunch of visuals, photos, videos, animations, stop motions, and various other things, right? So you want to have a consistency between the visuals when it comes to color, contrast, and sharpness, right? So I always prefer using the lenses from the same series for a particular campaign, right? So having said that, let's move on to the next lens, which is a telephoto lens. And in this case, I'm using a 70 to 200 lens, which I did not buy for product photography, by the way. I picked up this lens for travel photography, landscapes, and things like that for my personal work, right? But I happen to use it a lot for product photography as well. So this particular lens is Nikon 70 to 200 f4, right? So why I prefer using this particular 70 to 200 lens is for a reason, right? And the reason is that when I'm using the newer camera bodies like the Z9 or the Z8, Z7 II, etc., these camera bodies have a built-in feature for focus stacking, and that built-in focus stacking feature works best when you're using a Nikon lens with autofocus built in, right? So I mean, most of the lenses that I showed you here are pretty much manual focus lenses. The Zeiss and the 85 are all manual focus lenses, and this is the only Nikon lens that I have which has autofocus, right? So that's the reason why I use this particular lens whenever I'm doing focus stacking using the inbuilt camera feature, right? And in fact, let me show you one such example where I've used this lens for focus stacking to get amazing results. I'm very happy with the sharpness, colors, and contrast of this lens as well. So let's have a look at this particular shot. Now, if you look carefully, the entire photo, right from the crown on the perfume bottle to the refractions at the base, everything is in tack sharp focus, right? And this was possible only by doing focus stacking when I was using this particular lens and the inbuilt focus stacking feature, right? So let's have a look at the behind the scenes, and you will see that I'm using the focus stacking feature which is inbuilt in the camera along with the 70 to 200 lens that I just showed you, right? All right, so now let's come to the interesting bit, which is if I have to select just one lens that can handle pretty much 99% of my commercial product photography, then in that case, the lens would be this Nikon 85 tilt shift micro lens, right? Now, why I'm saying that is because firstly, it's a macro lens which I use pretty much all the time. The second reason is that it offers the tilt shift feature, which is very, very crucial, especially when you're shooting products, small products like, as I mentioned, jewelry, watches, cosmetics, drinks, and you want to have absolute control on the plane of focus, right? So in those situations, this lens really comes in handy, and I'm very, very happy with the results that I get from this particular lens. And as I said, this lens stays on my camera pretty much all the time. For most of my still work, I'm using this 85 tilt shift macro lens, right? And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to make a separate video where I'll show you how exactly I take advantage of the tilt and shift feature on this lens when I'm doing these high-end commercial projects, right? Right, so those are pretty much all the lenses that I use for high-end commercial work. Now, if you have any questions around lenses or product photography, feel free to drop your questions in the comments. And do give it a thumbs up if you enjoy watching such videos, and also consider subscribing if you want more such insights from the real world of advertising photography. Thanks for watching. I'm Kunal, and I'll see you all in the next one. Cheers.